So when we say a portion will be Q&A, that portion is very close to 100%. Feel free, whenever you have a question, to either raise your hand if you're stuck somewhere in the middle, or you can come to the mic there, and we will field your question when we can. But I mean, David and I, we kind of know each other. We kind of know what we do, so it's kind of weird to have like an interview. Like, I'm not gonna be like, so what's it like to be a conlanger, because I'm a conlanger too. But David, what's your favorite part of being a conlanger? I mean, I know what my answer is, but what do you derive the most pleasure from?
Before that, just real quick, is there anybody here who doesn't know what conlanging is? All right, let's do that first. All right, conlang. Conlang stands for constructed language. It's a word that the community came up with in the early 90s when they needed a name to go in the front of the listserv. So it would be something at, something.com. And so they decided, well, conlang is pretty short. And then people started using it. There were a bunch of other terms for it, like artificial language, model language, planned language. But conlang became the term for a constructed language, a consciously constructed language by an individual or group of individuals. And just last year, it made its way into the Oxford English Dictionary. So it's now the official word for language creation. So that is what a conlang is. And what a conlanger is somebody who creates languages, somebody who specifically, consciously sits down to create a brand new language, either with existing parts. This is what we call an a posteriori language, and you'll hear a little bit about that from Nick. Or an a priori language where all of the words are brand new and all of the grammar is brand new. Usually the grammar is brand new for both, but the words either come from an existing source or another one. So my favorite part of creating a language is actually the lexicon. So the language creation comes in different stages. Usually it starts with either with the sound system, the way the sounds that are going to be in the language and how they're put together into syllables and words. And then building up the grammar. That is, whether your nouns are going to express number, so whether there's going to be a plural number or not with the nouns, or something else like a dual number, meaning exactly two of something. Whether the noun is going to change its shape depending on its role in the sentence, whether it has gender or not. This is all something that the language creator decides. And then with verbs, things like whether you're conjugating the verb for person or tense or aspect or anything like that. After the grammar is kind of set, there's a much longer period of time where what you do is create words, and this is actually my favorite part. It's not really something that ends, so if you ask how long it takes, I'm still going for all the languages I have, and I imagine I will keep going until I die. And then at that point, it'll be done unless somebody else picks it up and creates new words. But that's just my favorite part, because when you're creating the lexicon of a language, when you're creating vocabulary, you're essentially telling the story of a people, whether they're a real people or an imagined people, about what kind of words they have to describe the world, how they came up with the words, both the sounds of them and their precise meanings. Just a really simple, kind of almost trivial example. In English we have teach, teacher, where one is obviously built off the other. Not the case in something like Spanish, where teach is enseñar, and then teacher is maestro. And there's a story there as to why you have the thing that's cognate with master in English as the word for teacher in Spanish. So those are the kind of stories you get to tell with your own language when building it up. So,
Yeah, I mean, my answer would be largely the same, although for a particular reason, both David and I mean, we're lucky enough to actually get paid to do this, but there's a lot of people who are doing this, but we are working with shows which have particular demands, and even though the nice thing about this being a really small field is very few people actually know how to judge what we're doing, so we're given a lot of liberty. Like, most of the time when we hand in something, they're like, great, we love it, we're going to use it, and we're not really going to change it. Sometimes they're like, hey, actually that kind of sounds a lot like a swear word in some other language that we want to broadcast the show in that country, we can't use it. But for the most part, we're given freedom. But there are creative constraints, and like David was saying, when you have to use the language to tell the story of the people, and so uh, with Dothraki, I mean, there's the characters that are described in the books and in the Expanse. I don't know, show of hands, how many people have watched the Expanse? Okay, good number. So the idea is that it is in our universe. 200 years in the future, these are people coming from cultures that you're familiar with. So my constraints are that I have to it has to be plausible that this is really like a way that the language could develop, that it could come from sources that already are existing. And so sometimes, I'll get a particular request from the producers. They'll say, we want a word that has this particular meaning, and not just this meaning, but like this cultural context. And there was one particular example was we need a word for a belter. And for those of you who haven't seen the show, the belters are people who live in the asteroid belt. And they come from a variety of different places on Earth, and they are the repressed underclass of outer space, and they have a very strong sense of identity and group identity, and they are very resentful of the rich inner planet people, so basically people on Earth and Mars. And so they have a word for somebody who is a belter who kind of is a traitor to their people. That this is somebody who is working for the inners, and of course it's a bad word. There are similar kinds of words, in cultures that we have on Earth, for race traitors essentially, and I won't say them because they're not polite. But in Belter, the word is wellwalla, and the way that I came up with that is, I mean, I wanted something that sounds good. I mean, that's always a consideration, is that it has to sound good. It has to be catchy. I mean, there is the aesthetic principle here, but a term that's often used in the show is the gravity well, referring to the gravity of the inner planets. And of course, asteroids have a much smaller. I mean, they have gravity, but it's negligible. And then wala is a suffix that comes from Hindi, and I was able to use this because it's presumable that in 200 years there are a lot of Hindi speakers that have made their way to the asteroid belt, and wala it's a productive suffix which it can be used for a lot of things in Hindi, but in Belter it's kind of like an agentive suffix, and I'll explain that jargon. It's when David was saying teach and teacher, the is basically, it's like someone who does this thing that the root word is. So and there's particular rules about when you can use agentivs. I won't go into that, but I just liked. I mean, I love that aha moment, of going through a bunch of different options and then finding the one that really like encapsulates the history of the people, as David says, and that it's one word and you hear it and it sounds cool, but then when you scratch the surface, you find this long story that actually it's a real etymology that goes all the way back to things that we're familiar with today.
What do you want to do now?
So seriously, feel free to ask questions.
Wait. Hold on a sec. There's another thing. So there's a mic over there for questions, but also there is somebody roving around that has one of these handheld mics. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand up real high, and you're looking for this person, right? Sorry, if I can just point over.
Okay. Go for it at the
You'll go
standing
second.
mic.
Don't worry, I see you. Y'all good.
Mic on?
It is now on. So I had a question. When you're working with the shows, the number of words, number of sentences you're able to express is always very small. And so how do you approach errors or slang, or are you always making the Queen's English version of Belter, or like a character that maybe makes grammatical errors? How is that perceived? Like, do you intentionally create mistakes, or do you always create the perfect version of whatever language you're creating?
So which show do we want to talk about here? I'll give you.
Both.
Okay, well, I'll give you several options. So in Game of Thrones, of course, the very first thing that we see from Dothraki is we see a non-native, non-Dothraki speaker being wedded to a Dothraki speaker. All of the Dothraki speakers are fluent, or native fluent, and that's fine. Throughout the course of the beginning of the first season of Game of Thrones, Daenerys is learning Dothraki. And so her speech is ungrammatical, but ungrammatical in a way that makes sense for somebody learning the language. And that honestly should have persisted a lot longer, but then at some point they said, all right, now she's supposed to be fluent. I'm like, all right, it's a fantasy show. But anyway, the nice thing, though, is that you can tell the difference in pronunciation, though. Even now. So even though Daenerys is fluent, you can tell when she's speaking that she's not fluent in Dothraki. So that's a lot of fun. Later with Valyrian, you'll see that, and the writers, especially Dan Weiss, he loves this stuff. He always likes to throw me stuff, see what I can do with it. Like he created. He wrote this sentence. It was Tyrion, who is shown throughout the past couple of seasons as not being super fluent in Valyrian. And so they actually wrote the line, I'm sorry, my Valyrian is a little nostril, and basically said, all right, I challenge you, David, make this make sense. And I was like, all right, cool, I can do that. So I just made the Valyrian word for nostril, which actually sounds very similar to the word that you would use for rusty in context. It's not actually rusty, it's a different expression that you would use in Valyrian, which I happen to forget, but it has nothing to do with rust. Anyway, so it's one of those things where when you hear it, it's very believable that somebody could make that mistake because the sound of those two things is very close. So that was Game of Thrones. Now Defiance is a lot more fun. Defiance, you had all of these aliens coming to Earth. They've lived there for about 40-some years. And what you have is basically non-native fluent speakers of English who are aliens. And then their children are being raised in an environment where their parents are speaking the alien languages to them, but everybody around them speaks English because the show takes place in America. So their version of their own language, their native language, is different from their parents because they're, basically not being raised in a totally fluent environment. And there's a lot of English influence. So they do things, when I get a chance to give dialogue for the younger people, they do things that their parents would kind of wrinkle their noses at, because they sound like a little Englishy. If I can give you like a natural language example, there was somebody who was raising it was a professor down in UCSD. She was a fluent Spanish speaker and raising her child to be a fluent Spanish speaker. But then suddenly, she was asking her about who she was speaking on the phone with, and she said in Spanish, "¿Quién hablaste con?" Which is directly English, like who did you talk with? But you absolutely cannot do that in Spanish. And so she heard that and was like, oh my God, what has happened to my child? That's the kind of stuff I got to create on Defiance, and it was awesome. And I heard somebody mentioning the 100. That's a complicated situation. We're not going to get into that one just yet.
Although the situation for 100, is a not too dissimilar idea with Belter Creole for the Expanse. They're both takes on where could English go. And one of the things that Dave was talking about, just language politics in general are extremely important when it comes to how languages change. The status of various languages, it matters as to how much influence they have. So if you are, if you're raising your kids in America where English is the highest status language, then English is going to have a big effect on, whatever your kids are speaking. But if you if you have English took over North America, and so that the native languages here now, because of a variety of terrible events, those languages are unfortunately considered to have a lower status, and they don't influence English, even though an English speaker could be surrounded by, or take Spanish. We hear Spanish all the time, and it doesn't really influence our English. And this plays a lot into how Belter developed. But to answer your question about how I got to sort of dealing with the non-standard varieties, something like Belter, because it's so low class, there's no distinction between, like, there is no Queen's version of Belter because there are no high status Belter. I mean, the high status Belters, their option for a high status language is English. And so it's this, like, in Peru and Bolivia, where Quechua, an indigenous language, the language of the Incans, where that's still spoken, you don't really have like Quechua slang, because Quechua is the slang. Like when you're speaking Spanish and you want to use slang, you use Quechua. But what I did get to do is, because they didn't want to have subtitles in the Expanse, I had to come up with a way to make times where Belter would be felt by the audience, but the audience still had to understand. And so what I would do is, you'd have Belters who are second, their second language is English, and they're speaking imperfect English. And so I had to figure out, okay, if you're a native speaker of Belter, what would your English look like? And the other thing is, with mistakes, when you're working with actors and constructed languages, there are inevitably mistakes, and I don't have to make them up. They'll do that for me. And there was there's an easy way to explain it away when people get really nitpicky, like, oh, in episode 6, it was so and so said this, but in episode 8, it was said slightly differently. I was like, well, dialectal variation.
Yeah.
So how much time do you spend studying other languages? And how much do you pull from those languages that you study to go into whatever new language that you're making?
I don't know how much time, because that's pretty much what I do for fun. So I don't know, all the time, maybe like, I don't know, hour a day. Yeah, I've gotten back to it because I had to get away from it for a bit, oddly enough, when I was studying linguistics in school, because I had so much work I had to do. But I gotten back to it. So I started studying a few years back, and I've studied since that time in order: Akkadian, Attic Greek, Modern Greek, Hindi, Japanese, and now I'm working on Finnish. And I'm going to be with Finnish for a little bit because I'm trying to gain fluency in it, because I made a bet with a blog in Finland that if the World Science Fiction Convention came to Helsinki in 2017, they could interview me again at the convention in Finnish, which I didn't know a word of. So I'm approaching the 1 year point, and then I kick it into gear in the second year. Right now I'm doing my background, and then after this, it's just all going to be learning to speak it. So yeah, all the time. But as far as borrowing things in, unless it's an a posteriori language, not much. I mean, you always see things that kind of inspire you one way or the other, but when you're creating a language, the result is probably going to end up resembling other natural languages on the planet just by happenstance, because given the parameters of language, there are only so many ways that they can vary. And so, like, for example, my first experience creating a really strongly head-final language, head-final meaning the most important part of the phrase comes at the end, was Castathan for Defiance. And in designing those relative clauses, which were very backwards of the way that you do it in English. In English, you'd say, like, the man I gave a book to, and then in a head-final language, you would say, like, the I a book gave man, which is really kind of backwards of the way we do it, hard to figure it out. So I came up with the way to do relative clauses in this, never having studied a language that worked that way. And then, I did it, managed to work. And then later when I came to Japanese and they started explaining relative clauses, I was like, I did it right. It worked.
Yeah, well, because Belter is an a posteriori language. The answer would be everything. I mean, that it all comes from somewhere. And I mean, there were a couple. Okay, 99.9%, because there were a couple words that were in the books. I was given a lot of liberty because the authors of the books that the TV show is based off of, they said to me, look, we're not linguists. We don't know what we're doing. We wanted to create a sort of effect, and we're totally amateur. Please, don't go with. Go with what we tried to do, not with what we did. But there were enough words that fans had glommed onto that they really liked that I had to hold on to. And then it became complicated because I had to come up with really, really weird etymologies for why it ended up that way and why certain phonological changes happened. And it worked, but it was tough. But I spent a lot of time studying language. I got into it all because my godfather was a hyper polyglot who, his name was Ken Hale. He was a professor at MIT, and he spoke, well, Wikipedia says 50. At home, we definitely witnessed a lot more than that even. There are crazy stories about him, like, commuting with a Mandarin speaker to work, half-hour drive each way. So the first week, after the first week, he was, conversational. After the second week, after the first week, he had the basics. Second week was conversational. Third week, he was fluent. Fourth week, he was correcting the guy. And so he was my idol. I spend probably 4 or 5 hours every day doing flashcards. That number has gone down a little bit in recent days, but in general, 4 or 5 hours, and it's absolutely essential because to go back to the well wall example, like it's much harder to say, okay, this is what I want. Because there's no search query that you can go through really and say, how do I find an agentive suffix that serves exactly this purpose and is used in this cultural context, and that also happens to sound like whatever. That's only. Maybe someday Google will figure out how to do that, but right now it's the human brain. That's the only machine that's capable of that. And so just being exposed to Hindi, I lived in India for a year and a half. I could draw on that for doing the work.
Hi. I have several questions, one of which you sort of touched on, and that is, do either or both of you have degrees in linguistics? I guess, David, you must have studied at my alma mater, UCSD. I was there a million years ago, but as a lit major. But
Yeah, actually, no, it's a good thing you brought it up since I didn't bring it up already. I have a BA in linguistics from here. Yeah, I graduated from Berkeley in 2003, and then I went from there to UC San Diego, where I graduated in 2005. And oddly enough, I was at UC San Diego yesterday, and here I am back at Berkeley, so it's nice to do it in 2 days. But yeah, so...
was this your chosen path from early on, that you wanted to make your professional life be about languages?
I don't think so, no. First of all, I didn't know what linguistics was till I got to college. And once I found out what it was, I wasn't interested in it. My mother was saying I should take a linguistics class, and I wasn't interested in it because I thought, well, linguists study language abstractly. They don't bother learning the language, so what point is it? Because I was taking a bunch of languages here. I took Arabic here, I took Russian here, I took French here, I took Middle Egyptian here, and I took Esperanto here, which was cool. It was taught by 2 native speakers.
I didn't know there was such a thing.
It happens. But yeah, I took my first linguistics class here from Sam Chombo, and it just absolutely blew my mind. And it was there that I came up with the idea to create my first language. And then I just kept doing it as I studied linguistics. And I guess it's been 16 years now.
And Nick, did you study linguistics?
So, like I said, my godfather was a linguist. My mother was a linguist. My father was not. He was a French professor, so language was absolutely in the family. And so I absolutely did not want to study linguistics. I did philosophy and philosophy of language, but the joke I use is that I never quite achieved escape velocity. I kind of fell back into linguistics. I don't have the degree. I've basically done a ton of coursework, and then my mom has a linguistics textbook. It's one of the #1 intro to linguistic textbooks on the market, and I've worked with her on that book so many times that I could teach that class. But actually, the title of the book is Linguistics. Sorry, what?
It's an intro text. You know, they always have those.
Yeah. It's MIT Press Linguistics. If you Google MIT Press Linguistics textbook, you'll find it. You can also search farmer, and that'll a title. But the way that I got into into conlanging, I mean, it's kind of a funny story. I was living in New York doing something completely unrelated. I was working in finance, and I didn't have a TV because my apartment was too small. I was watching Game of Thrones at a bar in Manhattan on Second Avenue, and then I don't know, episode 4 or 5, the episode ends. I turn around, and there's George R. R. Martin sitting like right next to me. And so I start talking to him. He's super nice, super. I mean, at that time he was very approachable. He was able to fly under the radar a little bit more because this was season 1. Not everybody knew who he was. I read the books. I saw the back. I mean, I knew who he was. And I didn't want to just be like, oh my God, I'm such a fanboy. So I asked if he wanted to give a talk at Google because my mom runs the program there, and he said, sure. Then his assistant was Ty Frank, who is one of the 2 writers of The Expanse, the books. And then I met Ty. Ty found out that I, spoke a lot of languages, and he said, well, would you be interested in creating one for the show? I mean, we just sold the rights, and then here I am.
Okay, so if I may, my other 2 questions are: could you talk a little bit about is it the Language Creation Society? Are you both members or proprietors, or that's your deal, David? Is that correct? And then let me just give you my last question. I'll sit down.
Sure.
I'm a Song of Ice and Fire reader and a Game of Thrones watcher, and made my living for many years as a writer and editor, but I have no credentials in linguistics. But I've always been fascinated by language, and it strikes me that the languages that you create for the show don't really bear any relation to any human language, at least that I know, at least etymologically. I mean, maybe structurally, grammatically they do. But so can you talk a little bit about the process of doing that? You've alluded to it already, but I mean, are you consciously trying to avoid anything that smacks of some recognizable human language? Are you working from Basque, or that was obviously a rhetorical remark, but you get what I'm driving at. So, thank you.
So first of all, the Language Creation Society is just a 501c3 nonprofit that's just dedicated to promoting language creation, and it's fortuitous to be discussing it here because the Language Creation Society was born here. In 2006, we held the first language creation conference over at the roof of the MLK Student Union, and that was basically the first time in history that people had gotten together to talk about the practice of language creation specifically. There had been plenty of congresses about some specific language like Esperanto or Noviel in the old days, plenty of Klingon, Klipmaz, but this was the first time people were getting together to discuss language creation. So that was in 2006. It was the brainchild of an undergraduate here at the time named Syfy, who had who taught a decal class. Decal, by the way, is one of the great things about Berkeley. That's a democratic education at Cal where a student can teach a class. That's how I learned Esperanto, and that's how I ran my pigeonization experiment. That was kind of a little conlang experiment that I did while I was here. So in 2007, when we had the second language creation conference here, literally next door, in that building that has a great big X on it, so I thought it would be easier to get money for the conference if we were a nonprofit. And so he did kind of the legwork. We wrote up an article, articles of incorporation and all that. We incorporated in California, and I was one of the original 10 directors. And 3 of us, Cy, John Clifford, who was a great conlanger and conlang enthusiast, and me, we were the ones that signed the document on July 7th, 2007, to make the Language Creation Society real. So that's what that is. And the next Language Creation Conference is going to be next year. We don't know where. I'm hoping Southern California, so I don't have to go anywhere. But so that's that part of the question. Second part of the question, what you're driving at is actually the distinction I mentioned at the very beginning, the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. So I'll give you just two examples. So like I have a language called Trigeta slang that's in the 100, and it is based entirely on modern English. It's what would happen if there were nuclear bombs all over the world and there was a pocket of English speakers in and around the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area, and what would happen to their language if they lived for another 100 or so years, because I think the initiation point was 50 years after now. So it's an evolved form of English. And so that means like when I come up with a new word, it's not like I'm making stuff up. You know, it comes directly from English. And the grammar itself is an evolved form of English. So there are things that should look very, very familiar. There are also things that have changed. The grammar has evolved a little bit, the sounds have evolved a little bit, and the word meanings have changed quite a bit. So that's what a posteriori means. You look at it, and even if you don't recognize a word, it always is going to come from English because that's the story for the language. Something like Dothraki or Valerian, that all of the words come from either the books that George R. R. Martin created, or they come from me, because that universe has no connection to ours. So then logically, those languages should have absolutely no genetic relation to ours. However, the result, the languages, so even though the words don't sound anything alike, the grammar should be fairly familiar, depending on, you know, what type of languages you're looking at. Dothraki has 5 cases that are primarily suffixal, very similar to something like Latin or Russian. Valerian has 8 cases, also suffixal. And it's like, you know, the word order of Dothraki and the order of elements is very similar to Spanish or Russian. No, more Spanish. The word order of High Valerian is much more similar to something like Japanese. And then there's a little element on the verbs where if you look at it, it kind of is reminiscent of some of the Tagalog, some of the Philippine languages. So you'll see things that are familiar. It's just that the words themselves are not going to be drawn from any source on earth.
So, and I'll add a little bit. There's a certain advantage to trying to avoid with these a priori languages, trying to avoid something that is too much like languages that already exist, because there have been cases of languages that sound a heck of a lot like languages that actually exist. The famous examples would be in Star Wars, where you have Jabba the Hutt who speaks something that sounds a heck of a lot like Quechua. And I know a lot of Quechua people that are not too happy about their language basically being the language of a gigantic, you know, space slug gangster. Also, the Ewoks, I've heard Tibetan and I've heard another language that was an inspiration. And
yeah, and the guys creating, they didn't really care.
No.
It was just like, well, whatever, this is some language. Who cares who speaks it? Who cares if we change it a little bit? Let's just, you know, modulate the voice a little bit, and there it is, you know.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, I've had people ask me that, like, oh, why don't you just pick like something that's only spoken by 3,000 speakers in, you know, the middle of Africa? Nobody will ever know. And I'm like, this is the age of the internet. Somebody will know, and then they'll tell everybody else.
Yeah.
So.
Cool.
Hey, yeah. So in the last episode of Game of Thrones, we learned that no spoilers. We learned that Dothraki doesn't have a word for castle or for armor, or does it? And so, like, how did that decision get made?
That was
Or
in
is
the
it just
last
a
episode?
I think so.
Whoa. What part?
At the end when she's giving the speech. And there's subtitles in English.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, they don't have a word for castle. They don't have a native word anyway, because they don't build stuff like that. This comes from the books. They don't build structures. The only things that they build are, like they say, are woven grass huts that are temporary.
Right.
So they don't build out of stone or anything like that. In fact, their only fixed structure is this city, Vias Dothrak, where the only fixed structures there are stuff that they've kind of stolen and taken and put there. So I figured, yeah, it doesn't make sense to have a word for stuff that they don't have. If they would have a word for it, it would be borrowed from something. It'd be borrowed from one of the Valyrian languages, but it was probably not, I don't know, it probably wasn't super important to use at that point. Man, I am not remembering this. There wasn't any Dothraki in the... Oh, yeah, well, yeah, oh, that's weird. So, but it translated that in the subtitles, huh?
Yeah.
Well, that, of course, that came from season 1. There's a lot of stuff where they're doing these callbacks. She just repeated a lot of the speech that Khal Drogo gave in episode 106 directly, and then they translated that stuff. So yeah, I mean, that's actually an open question when it comes to translation. So yeah, the literal translation of what they say when they talk about Westerosi armor, which is something that they don't use. They don't believe in armor. That was a discussion in episode 104, I want to say. They call them iron suits. But it's an open question if that's how you should translate it. Because when they say, Rogar Shikathi, they mean this armor that Westerosi people are wearing. So, like, you can say iron suits, I guess, but that's not what they mean, right? So, it's an interesting question. An interesting translation question, like what's appropriate when you're talking about how to translate stuff.
Well, and this is, I mean, it's something that happens with natural languages, and it's always something that's fun to do with a constructed language, which is figure out how a culture is going to divide up the semantic field differently from another one. So, I mean, in Belter, these are people who live their entire lives in outer space, so any gravity that they have is generated in one of two ways. Either it's, they're on a spinning space station, or, continual thrust. And for the most part, I mean, the space stations came after the thrust. I mean, it's a lot easier to just, accelerate in one direction than it is to construct something that's going to, rotate, or, to spin up an asteroid. They don't. So in Belter, I mean, the word that they have that we would translate as gravity is literally just no thrust, because the way that they distinguish is between either you're under thrust or you're not under thrust. And so it doesn't make sense. I mean, they talk about the well, but that has completely different, it means something completely different to them than being under thrust. And one of the sort of, if this is something that people do when they're speaking another language, this is something that, people might make I won't say it's a mistake, but you're not, if you're not taking it into consideration, you're not taking the conlanging thing to its fullest potential. If you're just only considering making words that are coming from the same semantic space as English, I mean, you want to try and think, okay, how are these people going to look at the world, and how is that going to affect their language?
Yeah.
Hi, my question is about copyright, and I'm specifically thinking of something like Klingon, and I think there was a lawsuit. I'm not sure what all the details were, but basically some fans wanted to create a movie and they got sued over it. So my question is, you can't really copyright something like the English language, but you guys as writers and creators, people who do this as your profession, what are your thoughts and opinions on that?
Well, I was semi-involved with that, actually. So what was happening was Paramount was suing these guys who were making a fan film. And they said, well, what, because they say you're violating our IP. And they said, well, what are we violating? And they listed a whole bunch of things. And one of the things they said was you're using the Klingon language. And that was when the Language Creation Society stepped in, because you absolutely cannot copyright a language. I don't care whether it's created or real. They actually try to do this. Like, I remember, this was an early case, a real case in the early 20th century. Some guy put out a dictionary and said that because of that, everything that's written in English, they owe me royalties. And they're like, no, sir, that doesn't work. So it's like, the end result of this case, by the way, which is not surprising to me, but kind of a disappointment, is that Paramount just dropped it. So they just said, whatever. So we still live in this nebulous time where companies believe that they own the copyright to these languages, but it's never been tested. I mean, it's no question that if you produce a document, then it's immediately copyrighted by you unless you've signed over those rights to a corporation, in which case it's immediately copyrighted by them. But the grammar or dictionary of a language, no matter how complete it is not the language. I mean, it's a book that can tell you how to speak the language, but it itself isn't the language. So there's no way, like, if somebody wants to write an original song and put all the lyrics in Klingon, absolutely they can do that. And right now, I think perhaps there are corporations that think that they can sue people over this, but it's never actually been tested. So we're still waiting.
Yeah, my feelings are slightly complicated on the matter, of course, in a spirit of self-interest. it would be great if I could just own the copyright to a language that would be, valuable and all that. And I'm in a complicated situation of, because everything that we produce as consultants for the show is what's the term that they use, like
Owned, yeah, it's work for hire.
for hire.
Owned in perpetuity throughout the
Exactly.
universe.
So everything that appears in the show, they own the rights to, and it makes sense because they don't want us to just be able to sue them, cease and desist. They have to, but then, in the contract, they wanted me to put in that they own the language. I finagled my way out of it. I said, no, you just own this particular dictionary. And they again, if they're not a linguist, so they don't necessarily know what they're reading. It's nice to be able to outsmart the suits, but. But there's still a question. Like, if I wanted to put out a dictionary, or someone else wanted to put out a dictionary and publish a dictionary, I mean, like, they would try and sue them, and it hasn't been resolved. I mean, we don't have a precedent still.
Yeah.
On the other hand, though, I'm not too worried. Also, from my perspective, because this is geek culture. People care about canon, and we are the ultimate source of canon. So, I mean, there are cases in the past where, language creators have given, the creative control of the language to groups of people. But for the meantime, I mean, like, if he says this is the Dothraki word for whatever and it's a new word, I mean, nobody's going to say, no, it's not.
Yeah.
So maybe another follow-up on geek culture. We've talked a lot about the sort of origin story behind the languages both of you guys have created, but has anything surprised you once those languages go out into the world? Like, what have fans been doing with your languages, with Belter and Dothraki and the rest, that maybe you didn't expect?
Well, I would say the thing that has surprised me the most is what my most popular language is. Because it's not Dothraki or Valyrian. There's no question that Game of Thrones is the most popular show I work on. But when it comes to an actual language being popular, there's no question the most popular language is Tree-Geta slang. And that's been a big surprise to me. It's on the 100, and I gather there are probably people here who've never heard of the 100. It's a television show. It's on the CW. It's pretty good most of the time. But yeah, it was like, when it comes to like fandom and people being really, really excited about the language, that really didn't happen for me until I started working on this show. And it was kind of a surprise because basically this language is probably the easiest language for a modern English speaker to learn. I mean, period. Because it's very, very, very similar to English. Every single word comes from it. I mean, you have to learn a bunch of new terms, but I mean, if you turn on the television and see a commercial for some new drug, you find yourself having to learn a new term anyway, so it's not that big a deal. Seriously, that's what I would do for these words that were in there. Just say, it comes from something like Cialis. I mean, that's our most productive area of brand new stems is new names for drugs. It's amazing. I saw one just the other day, had a J, an X, a Z, and a Q in it. I mean, it's brilliant for Scrabble. Yeah. But so that was the thing that surprised me a little bit. But I guess it's because my theory is that the audience of the 100 skews younger. The language is very, very easy to learn and understand because it's basically English, there was, the 100 was popular enough that people were interested in. So that's what surprised me the most. But also the tattoos are the coolest.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my experience has been similar, probably because the Belter, it's not quite the same genesis as I can't pronounce it.
Tree-Geta slang. It's from tree, gather, slang.
Okay. Belter is it's a creolized English, so there's a lot of other things that have happened to it. It's changed a lot more because of extreme language contact than if you had, say, isolation in 100 years. But the thing for me that's been surprising is, and it's funny because the person who I'm about to talk about in this story is actually right here. When I go into a bar and the bartender starts speaking to me in Belter, and I have this sudden realization that, holy cow, there's somebody that speaks my language way better than I do.
Cool. Oh, by the way, just the person with the roving mic, there have been questions periodically in the audience. Just want to.
Yeah, hi. A little just back one thing about that. We're saying, first of all, about canon and geek culture. Yet on the other hand, also very strong in geek culture is the whole idea of forking. You even saw it in conlangs in Lojban driving from Loglan, originally source core that Lojban came out of was Loglan.
Yep.
And you also see it all the time in open source. It is the whole open source community is about that. The whole geek culture in general is about the whole idea of forking. And you do not see much forking in that community, and also about, that's, canon, what is canon anymore mean in that sense with the whole idea of forking?
Oh, well, first of all, you know that there was a huge lawsuit between Loglan and Lojban. So it wasn't like that was totally amicable. And I think there were. Okay, so there's a language called Loglan where they were trying to, the guy was trying to make formal logic into a language, and it went along for quite some time. There were some people that wanted to make some changes to it, and that one was Lojban, and then the original creator basically sued the other guys, saying you can't do that. There was a big court case. He lost, of course, because they could. And now Lojban, I mean, nobody talks about Loglan anymore. Lojban is pretty big. So if you know about created languages, or let's say this was the year 2000 and you knew about created languages, you either knew about Tolkien's languages, Quenya, Sindarin, or you knew about Esperanto, or you knew about Klingon, or you knew about Lojban. Those were basically the 4 languages that people knew about. So there's an interesting question about what happens with this stuff when for 2 events. One is when the media is done with. So like this has happened for me with a couple of shows, like Starcrossed was canceled, Defiance was canceled, and it's not as if there are books about that. It's not as if there are spin-offs. Essentially, that canon period is done. So really, it's up to the fans at that point to decide, first of all, are we going to pay attention to this language at all anymore? And second, are we still going to treat the author as the sole source of canon? And like I said, it's totally up to them. I mean, I'd be kind of pissed off if they didn't, but it's not like I'm going to do anything about it, or that I feel like I should be able to do anything about it. That is something perfectly acceptable that people can do. So that's one, and of course the other one is when the creator dies. And this is the type of thing where you do see splits, and you do see people getting upset with each other. And the prime example of this was the Lord of the Rings movies, where they needed dialogue from Tolkien's languages, and Tolkien's languages are not super complete, and so they hired David Sallow to translate the dialogue. But there were certain things where he needed more words, or there wasn't a canon way to do that particular expression, and so he had to come up with stuff in order to be able to do the dialogue in the spirit of Tolkien. And within the community, not just within the community of Tolkien fans, but within the community of the fans of Tolkien's languages, which is very big, this was a very divisive thing. There are some people who said, like, of course, what else is he going to do? It's either this or don't have his languages in the movie, right? And so I think most people were fine with it, but there were some people in the community that were really, really upset with it, saying you cannot call this Quenya. It's not Quenya. Tolkien didn't do it. And so it's a travesty that this happened, and blah, 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 flame wars and so forth. So it's not as if, like, even within the community, either the language creation community or the community for the fans of a specific language, that there's one mind about how this should work. I think that the only thing that we can say for certain is that there's nothing legally against it. And I think that's the way it absolutely should be. Forking, like, well, like this example where, Tolkien created Quenya, then he died, and then we have this situation where somebody needs to create something more. So, I mean, in one sense, you could say, oh, it's the same language and it continues in this tradition, but in another sense, you say, like, well, actually, it stopped here, and this is something different. So now you have something new over here and something that was in the canon completely over here, right?
Well, and my perspective on this, to a certain degree, is that, I mean, we are... Okay, in the case of something like Lojban, which is not a language that anybody could ever learn in a way that you learn English or natural language. I mean, it's your brains don't process it that way.
People use it.
People use it,
like,
But
online.
people, I mean, I'm not saying that you can't use it, but your brain just doesn't process it in the same ways that it processes a natural language. If you're working on, I mean, if you're trying to create a language that approaches a natural language, first of all, it's, you'll never quite get there. But if that's kind of what you're going for, which is, in the languages that we've been talking about that we've created, what we are going for, I mean, you then kind of, even if it's a constructed language, like there are, in my opinion, certain aspects of natural language that have to be taken in consideration. And one of them is that languages change. And that's not a bad thing. It just is a thing. And I mean, as people adopt the language, I mean, from my perspective, there's always going to, I mean, it's already a transmission from parents to children in natural language. There's change. That I'm not going to say that this is the driver of change, but there is change because there are mistakes in transmission. The mistakes in transmission from us to fans are much larger. I mean, there may be some people who really get nitpicky about it, but it changes a lot. And that's okay because it's a natural language. And I expect that I would love for it to be widely adopted. I mean, look at Esperanto. I mean, there have been people who've tried to keep Esperanto as close to, the original. But as there have been the occasional native speakers, those native speakers are changing it. And that's kind of, in my mind, a success that, like, wow, it really is a language now. It's a full-fledged natural language now.
When you sit down to create a new language, I'm wondering if you could go a little more into the creative process around that, and also maybe give a glimpse into if you have any like maybe rituals or things that you do to help get started with that.
Sacrifice a lamb.
I guess the very first thing is it has to start with the idea. Because creating a language, for example, where you're deriving the words from other languages is a very different project from creating a language that's, a priori, where all of the stems are brand new and you're creating them. Also very different from, like, I worked on a show called Penny Dreadful, where the entire point, or this little language piece, I wouldn't even call it a language, is that it was a corruption of human language that you could only ever understand if you were touched by the devil, and that the language itself would change. If you started to understand it, suddenly the grammar would change, the words would change. And so, like, that was a totally different process, where, first of all, I was working with natural languages, but I wasn't producing something with them that you could ever use as a language, because that would defeat the purpose. You weren't supposed to. So that was a really different project. So it has to absolutely start with, why am I doing this? And this is kind of what I go through step by step in the book I did. I'm always supposed to mention that, and I always forget. The Art of, the name of the thing. Yeah, The Art of Language Invention. That's my book. And so like the idea is you start with there and figure out, okay, what is it that I'm doing and why? Once you know what you're doing, there are different things that you have to do depending on which tack you're taking. So since Nick's language is a posteriori, I'll tell you about the Apriori Root. The first step I do is, especially if you're working with producers, all they care about is the sound. So you got to make a sound for them that they approve of, which usually means if they want a harsh language, it has ch. If they want anything else, it doesn't have ch, which is stupid. But, I try my best. They also always say that they want it to be a language that's easy for the actors to speak. And all of the actors are monolingual English speakers, which is kind of like saying, we want a really, really colorful painting, and we want you to use blue. It's like, all right. So once it's settled on the sound, like what I do at that point is I usually create fake words in a fake sentence. It doesn't mean anything at all. They're just word-like elements in a sentence-like element with sentence-like intonation based on the intonation that I'm thinking. I send that to them until they say okay. Then I go back and I start by creating the sound system. That's choosing all of the sounds that appear in the language, but it's also choosing how those sounds are reified in the language. So for example, a nice easy one for English is that we have two different types of P's. One type of P has a nice puff of air that you hear if you put the microphone really close to your face. It's awful. Sound engineers hate it. The other P doesn't have that puff of air, and they occur in very, very predictable environments. So pi has that nice puff of air. Spy doesn't. No puff of air at all with the P in spy. So this is what's called allophonic variation. So you have to choose all of the sounds and then choose how they're going to show up in words. And then for me, when I'm creating a naturalistic language, you have to start with basically an older form of the language and evolve it forward. That's what's going to give you your allophony. That's what's going to tell you why the sound occurs this way in one environment and this way in another environment. And from there, you build out your syllables, decide, are these going to be syllables that can only have, one consonant at the beginning followed by a vowel, like in Hawaiian, where there's never a consonant at the end of a syllable? Or is it going to be something like Georgian, where you have like, sorry, what was the word? I always forget the end of it. But it starts with a G, V, TS apostrophe, P, R. Like, it starts with like 6 consonants in a row. You can do that in Georgian. It's wonderful. English is pretty bad too. We have strengths, which is just the worst word in the world. Terrible. So you're deciding that, how your syllables work, what your word shapes are going to look like, and then from there you move on to the grammar, where, like I said, you decide what categories, what types of words you're going to have. You're always probably going to have nouns and verbs, but it's an open question if you're going to have a separate category for adjectives. Not all languages do. Open question if you're going to have a separate category for adverbs. Not all languages do. To decide if you're going to have prepositions which come before noun phrases, or postpositions that come afterwards, or circumpositions that come on both sides, or impositions that usually come, they're either at the beginning or the end of a noun, but then adjectives and modifiers come outside of it. You can do that type of a thing. All of these are decisions that you have to make, and then once that's done, then you can work on sentence structure and decide how regular clauses work, WH questions, yes-no questions, relative clauses, subordinate clauses, emphasis, de-emphasis, all that stuff. Basically, you go through step by step till you got everything. Then you try it out with translation, see how it sounds, and then, like I said, the rest of your entire life is spent just fleshing out the lexicon. Also, derivational morphologies in there.
Yeah, so that's a lot of jargon, but it when you get started doing it, especially when you get to that stage where you start translating, if there's anything that you missed, you realize it pretty quickly because you're like, darn, how do I say this? Oh, well, I'll have to figure out something that works. So for me, I have sort of all those constraints and then even more constraints because it has to be, which actually in a way makes it easier because I'm not starting with a blank page. I mean, I not only know that, okay, this is going to be an English-based Creole, but I also know that it is going to be a Creole, a Creolized language. And while there's an immense amount of academic debate about what is a Creole, where do Creoles come from, blah, 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 there are a lot of examples of languages that are widely agreed upon to be Creoles, and they have a lot of characteristics in common, and so I could very easily model off of that. And the constraint for actors having to be able to speak it is a really hard one because one of the things is you especially so in the case of the Expanse, you don't necessarily have too many principal actors speaking this language a lot, and the principals are the ones who get worked with. They're the ones who can invest the time in learning this stuff because they know they're going to need it for at least one season, if not more seasons. Unfortunately, the Belter is often spoken by day actors who get like a quick 30
They're terrible.
minute. It's bad, and like yeah, I mean, there were a lot of times where the producers had to say, you know what, we're just going to have to cut this out because so-and-so just couldn't pull it off. Bilingual actors always do better at this than monolingual actors. The other thing about painting an entire colorful painting in blue is that I was given the wonderful constraint of, okay, we need a foreign language, so not a dialect of English, like a full-on separate language that can be easily understood by an English-speaking audience without subtitles. And you're just working It doesn't happen. I mean, you know, one of the possible definitions of how you separate languages is that they're not mutually intelligible. I have problems with that definition, but whatever. But one of the nice things though about Belter is that, and being a Creole, is that one of the things that happens with Creoles is that the sounds inevitably, the phonology becomes something, I won't say more basic, but something where you're more likely to get common sounds in the world's languages. So, you know, there are definitely, I mean, just in the world's languages, you're a lot more likely to find m than you are to find for, you know, a variety of reasons. And so, thankfully, because Creoles have that, it made it a heck of a lot easier coming up with a sound system that actors can do, because every actor can go m.
We're getting short on time, so we should
you.
try to be quick.
I have a quick question that's less to do with like specific languages, but just like the
Go ahead.
got to do with the whole industry. So in the end, at the end of the line, like shows have to make money and they have to be popular. So what's it like applying such a creative endeavor such as creating languages to like a show that's like at the end dealing with money and like has to make money? Sort of like a composer scoring music for film kind of deal.
Well, the thing is, we wouldn't be working on the show if the showrunners didn't want it. And you know, the showrunners are the one that dictate all of this, because there are plenty of shows that could have had created languages or movies, and they didn't because the showrunner or the director didn't want it. So it comes from them, and for them, it's just their vision. So they don't think about money when it comes to this. I mean, and unless we say we're going to charge $58 million, then maybe they think about it a little bit. But no, they think about their vision first and let the producers worry about money.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started going through the process of negotiating, you know, what would be done and how it would all be paid, I got a lot of people being like, "Oh, it's Hollywood. You're going to get ripped off. Be careful. Get an agent. Get a lawyer. Get blah 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 blah." And my experience has been wonderful. I mean, like I've really been treated with a lot of respect. Like, you know, they like to hear from me. They like to work with me. I like to work with them. I mean, you have to build a good relationship. If they ask for something, you don't give it back to them in 2 weeks. You give it back as soon as you can. There was a time when I was about to take an intercontinental flight and I got an email like, "We need this by tomorrow." And I said, I won't be here while we need it. So I was sitting like on my phone writing in Google Drive like translations for stuff, you know, right before I'm board. Actually, as I was boarding the plane. You know, and yeah, the showrunners are great. It gets a little harder when you start to work with people about the auxiliary sort of like, you know, stuff, because then you're getting into marketing and the money stuff and like, okay, are we going to have merchandise that has the language on it? Are we going to have books? Are we going to, you know, whatever? And then it's like, yeah, I may have the ideas, and that's a little harder because the primary consideration then is money, not necessarily the creative side.
They're not very good with that, to be honest.
They're totally not good enough with it. There's so much more that could be done.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this conversation. On the one hand, there's a Faustian or Promethean thing where you've pledged something perpetually in the ownership of someone in all the universe. I feel that way too. On the other hand, language preservation is real. And there's a hobbit-looking man named Malcolm Margolin who had a conversation with Larry Rinder, the curator here. And he has an organization called Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival.
Nice.
Because the people who were living here before the 49ers were worshiping the fish and the bear because they owned the land before they did. And we don't even have a lot of those words, those songs, those languages. So if anyone is interested in it, you can become involved as a 501c3. Thank you.
Cool.
So one of my goals with Belter, because it's a Creole, is I wanted to educate people about Creoles. I mean, they're not indigenous languages, but they are the languages of underprivileged people, like in Haiti, for example. And more needs to be done, for example, in Haiti to have educational materials in Haitian as opposed to in French, because it's like going to school.
Still?
Yeah, Haitian is the official language, and like 99% of the population does not speak French. 95% of the educational materials are in French. It's like going to school
Ridiculous.
and
That's
like
ridiculous.
your classes are taught in, Latin or well, like Old English, like, yeah, okay, there's some genetic relationship, but seriously, like, how many of you have tried reading Beowulf in the original? You can't.
So over here.
Yeah, I just was wondering if there are other applications for constructed languages outside in the entertainment industry and books. If there's some other uses have been found, which.
Well, probably the most successful created language was Esperanto, whose application is, I suppose, just people use it. People speak it for international communication. So, I mean, that's an obvious use. I mean, it is a language after all. You can use it. So pretty much anything that you can use a language for, you can also use a constructed language for. When you get into things like programming that's above my pay grade, I don't know a thing about it, but code breaking, yeah, in a sense. Or the opposite. What's the opposite of code breaking? Encryption. Yeah. Oh man, I really think that they don't make enough use of conlangers for that, because they should. I mean, it's one thing to take the language like English and scramble it up, and then you figure out what the scramble is, and suddenly it's English and you can understand it. What if it were a created language? So you unscramble it, and suddenly you don't get anything. You can understand. Come on, that would be useful.
Yeah, the famous example being the Navajo Windtalkers, and part of what made that really difficult was what I mentioned before about the semantic fields and how it's divided up. That like even if you get all the words and you try, it's hard to figure out the meaning, just because they may English, the semantics may have drifted in one way, and for them it's drifted in another way. They divide things up in a different way. Like certain things in English, are on a table, and for them it may be at a table, whatever. And that adds another layer of difficulty. I mean, language is incredibly complicated. It's a hard code to break.
Oye, den kopeng. Mi tenyo to questions para to. Ditim to du shitehiting ere dalam lam sheng.
Yeah, so there's the bartender who speaks Belter. And if I understood the question right, you were asking when I sacrifice the lamb. Is that true?
Lam sheng is a.
Oh, is it a real lamb? No. It's all in my head. It's in my twisted mind.
Also, ditim to pensa era lang belta. Tenyo to what lang belta favorite era korito. Tenyo pensa to wang what lang belta imogut.
Okay, so his question was, when you're thinking about Belter, what's your favorite language? Or what's your favorite word, I mean. And also a great example of how in transmission there was a slight difference. The way that he formed the question was the way that we would in English by fronting it. So or actually no, it would be more like in German. But anyway, it doesn't matter. My favorite, well, I've got two. One that I thought of earlier, and I forget what the context. Oh, with Cialis and the drugs. So of course, this is our world 200 years in the future. So things that are going on now are history in the future, and so the word for the act of singing is adewu, and because in 100 and whatever years there was this like retro mania for Adele. And, people just and then, 20 years later, people forgot about Adele, but for whatever reason, to Adele, do adeu, that just stuck in the language. And, there's plenty of examples in English and other languages where things like this have happened. So that's one. The other is Beke de Bouche, which means delicious. And I got that one because I was at a Hawaiian restaurant and I saw in Hawaiian Pidgin, and I thought, I gotta borrow from Hawaiian Pidgin if I'm making a Creole. This expression, broke de mouth, which means something that's so delicious that it broke your mouth. And so I thought, okay, how do I translate that into Belter?
Shishitaki-taki. Duferi de belt. Tolora mosh do shoha era sif Ketinke Mikangdu for the OPA.
Are we out of time, or do we have time for one more? 3 minutes. It's not going to take that long. So you kind of hinted at this a minute ago, the future of language creation, people talking about English and text leading way to emoticons at this point, and what's the future of sound creation with regard to language creation? Are you incorporating synthesized sounds? Are you using languages that are not human languages?
Probably the best example of an alien language that I've seen is Dennis Moskowitz's Rikchik, which can't be used by humans. Well, unless I guess you write it. But they're for these aliens that don't have mouths or ears, just one big eyeball on their globe, and they have 49 tentacles, and then 7 of them are kind of shorter, and they can use them like arms. And so the language is sign language using these 7 tentacles, which are very posable, so they can make them go in funky, weird shapes. So that was I think one of the best examples I've ever seen of an alien language. There's no hope that you could ever use it. It could be animated, and you can kind of write it down, but it's not like you can speak it or hear it or anything. I always wanted to have the opportunity to try to create an alien language for a different vocal tract. It's something that you can do. You can synthesize different vocal tracts and produce different sounds. Depending on where the bumps are in the mouth, where the nodes and the antinodes are in the standing wave that is formed in the tract, you could actually produce different sounds that would sound totally different that we can't produce with human mouths. But I mean, when you're talking about doing this for production, you're not going to do that. I mean, they gotta cast humans, and it'd be really expensive to synthesize that vocal tract and to make sure that everything goes through it. It's possible, though. It is absolutely possible.
Yeah, so one of the things that came up in the Expanse is the belters, when they live in 0G, they end up growing really tall and thin, and there are major changes physically because of never being exposed to gravity. And there was discussion, should we spend time figuring out how this would affect, the vocal, everything that we use to produce sound, and then incorporate that into Belter. And I think the discussion was that's a nice thought, but we have a budget. And I mean, it's also another one of those things that if you're talking about this just from a theoretical standpoint, it's absolutely fascinating to think about. But I mean, when you're working for a show, the ultimate goal, aside from making money, is entertainment and the aesthetics. And sometimes what is sort of the most scientifically accurate, plausible, et cetera, is not the most aesthetically pleasing.
What are the most useful tools you found? You've mentioned Google Drive or dictionaries.
There are actually sound change generators, so that you can input your own phonology and see what it would be like if you employed sound changes and have it generate a bunch of words. Awkwords is one of them, AWKWORDS. For just creating a dictionary and stuff, I just use Pages on the Mac, which is the Mac version of Word. And I love it. But absolutely, cloud, the cloud is wonderful now. You can work on the same stuff anywhere. And then for scripts, I use Final Draft, which is what the script writers use.
Yeah, I mean, spreadsheets, you have to be able to keep track of all of this. And I mean, unless you commit yourself to literally learning the language yourself, like making flashcards and practicing it, I mean, you need a second brain, and you need to be able to search it. It needs to be organized with all the tags, part of speech and etymology, blah, 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 whatever you need to be able to find it, because at the end of the day, you're going to have hundreds, thousands of words, and you're not going to remember them all. I think that's it. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks.
Great questions, everybody.